The morning Inez Whitaker buried her husband, the banker was already waiting at the gravesite with papers tucked under his arm, and she knew then that the real trouble had not yet begun. The date was April the 3rd, 1879, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat on the southern edge of civilization like a boot print left in drying mud. The cattle drive still thundered through twice a year, kicking up dust that settled on windowsills and in the creases of people's faces and in the corners of their hearts. It was a town that had seen better days and expected worse ones, a town where a woman alone was considered either a burden or an opportunity, depending on who was doing the considering. Inez was 31 years old and had not cried yet. She had wanted to, felt the pressure of it sitting behind her eyes like storm water behind a dam, but there was too much to attend to and not enough time to fall apart. Daniel Whitaker had died of a fever that took him in 3 days, and she had spent those 3 days at his bedside mopping his brow and listening to him breathe, and then listening to him stop. She had a daughter named Clara who was 9 years old and looked at everything with enormous, solemn brown eyes. She had a cattle ranch that was 400 acres of good grassland and creek-fed pasture 7 miles outside of Caldwell. And she had a deed to that land, signed in her husband's name, that the banker Harlan Goode was very interested in acquiring. Harlan Goode was a short man with long fingers and a way of smiling that never reached his pale blue eyes. He stood beside the freshly turned earth of Daniel's grave in a black suit that cost more than most men in Caldwell earned in a month, and he waited until the last of the other mourners had paid their respects and drifted back toward town before he approached her. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, removing his hat with practiced sincerity, "I am deeply sorry for your loss. Daniel was a fine man." "He was," Inez agreed, not looking at him. "I wanted you to know that the note on the property comes due in 60 days, Goode said, and he said it gently, the way a man says something unpleasant when he has rehearsed the gentleness carefully. Daniel had taken out a second loan in January. I imagine he intended to tell you when the time was right." Inez turned her head slowly and looked at him. She was a striking woman even in grief, with dark hair pinned beneath a black bonnet and eyes the color of good coffee, steady and warm and capable of holding a great deal. "How much?" she asked. $420, Goode said. "Plus interest it comes to just over $500. She could have sooner reached up and touched the sun. The cattle were not ready to sell. The winter had been hard and the herd thin. There was perhaps $50 in the strongbox at the ranch and a few more in the account at Goode's own bank, which she suspected was not entirely coincidental. "I see," she said. "I would be willing to take the deed as payment in full," Goode offered, and now the smile reached just a little closer to his eyes. "You could stay on as a tenant for a reasonable rate. I would not put you and the child out." Inez looked back at the grave. The fresh mound of earth was dark against the pale spring grass, and the wooden cross she had hammered in herself that morning was already leaning slightly in the wind. "I will manage the note," she said. "Thank you for your condolences." She walked back to her buckboard where Clara was sitting with her hands folded in her lap, watching the horizon with those grave brown eyes, and Inez climbed up beside her daughter and took the reins without another word. She spent the next 2 weeks taking stock of her situation with the methodical clarity of a woman who cannot afford to panic. She counted every head of cattle, which came to 63. She assessed the hay stores and the condition of the fence lines and the reliability of the 2 ranch hands Daniel had employed. A weathered man of 50 named Pete Dawson, who had been with the ranch since before her marriage, and a young man of 20 named Kobe Sutton, who was willing but not yet seasoned. She went through every piece of paper in Daniel's roll-top desk and found the loan documents and read them twice, and then set them aside with the careful stillness of a woman setting down something that might break. The note was real. The deadline was real. She wrote letters to her brother in Missouri and received a reply explaining that times were hard for him too. She inquired discreetly about the prices cattle might bring at the summer drive and was told the market was uncertain this year, the northern buyers cautious. She had 60 days, and the days did not wait for her grief to finish. It was on the 14th day after the funeral that Robert Bishop rode into Caldwell with a string of horses, a bedroll, and a reputation that preceded him about 3 hours in advance, carried in by a drover named Marcus who had seen him on the road south and recognized him from the year before. Marcus told the story in the Silver Star Saloon, which was the kind of place where stories both started and ended, and the room listened with the particular attention people pay to information about a dangerous man arriving in their vicinity. Robert Bishop had been a Texas Ranger for 6 years before he quit, Marcus said. Before that, he had worked cattle drives from San Antonio to Abilene and knew the Kishom Trail the way most men knew their own back pastures. He was quiet, people who knew him said, the way a loaded gun is quiet. He was not a troublemaker, but he was not a man you made trouble for either. He came into the Silver Star himself about an hour after Marcus, walking with the long, unhurried stride of a man who had covered great distances on foot and found them unremarkable. He was 34 years old, though he looked both younger and older depending on the light, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the collar and jaw that had not seen a razor in perhaps 4 days, and gray eyes that catalogued a room the way a military man reads terrain. He was lean and tall and wore his Colt on his right hip the way working men do, not low like some show rider trying to impress a crowd, but at a natural level, worn into the leather of his holster through years of daily use. He ordered 1 whiskey, which he drank slowly, and he was looking for work. He was not looking for trouble, and he was not looking for complication, and he certainly was not looking to be moved by any woman's particular brand of determination. He had told himself all of this very firmly for the past 2 years, ever since his engagement to a woman in San Antonio had dissolved so bitterly that the memory of it still appeared in his chest, sometimes like a stone he had swallowed and not yet passed. He heard about the Whitaker widow from Carl Hennessy at the bar, who brought her up in the context of the available ranching work in the area. Her husband had just died, Carl said, and she was short-handed, and the summer drive was coming, and she had a small operation but a good one if someone with sense could manage it. "Is she looking for help?" Robert asked. "She's too proud to say so out loud," Carl said, "but anyone with eyes can see it." Robert finished his whiskey and thought about it. He needed work, and he was not particular about the nature of it. He was good with cattle and good with horses and good at keeping order, which was often the most valuable skill on a short-staffed operation. He decided he would ride out to the Whitaker place in the morning and see if they could come to terms. He did not expect anything except a business arrangement. He was very firm on this point with himself. The Whitaker ranch looked better from a distance than it did up close, which was true of a great many things in Kansas in 1879. The house was solid and well built, a 2-story structure with a covered porch, and the barn was large and in decent repair. But the fence along the north pasture had sections that needed immediate attention, and the cattle in the near field were thinner than they should be this far into spring, and the overall air of the place was that of something that had been well tended but was now running slightly behind, the way a watch runs slow when it needs winding. He rode up to the house on a bay horse named Dust, and found Inez Whitaker on the porch repairing a piece of harness with a leather awl and a look of concentration that suggested she was not thinking about the harness at all, but about something considerably weightier. She looked up when he rode into the yard and did not reach for anything or startle or smile. She just looked at him with those coffee-colored eyes and waited. "Morning," he said, reining Dust to a stop. "My name is Robert Bishop. I heard in town you might be in need of a hired hand. I have experience with cattle drives and general ranch work. I'm looking for steady employment." She studied him for a moment longer than was strictly polite, but it was the study of a woman assessing a tool for its usefulness, not the flirtatious examination some widows might deploy. "Carl Hennessy send you?" she asked. "He mentioned the situation," Robert said. "I came of my own accord." "What were you doing before this?" "Ranging, before that cattle drives. I know the Kishom and the Western Trail both. I know stock and I know fences, and I can keep ranch hands in line if needed." "I have two hands," she said, "Pete Dawson and Kobe Sutton. Pete is experienced but slow. Kobe is quick but green. I need someone who can manage the drive to the buyer at Wichita in 6 weeks and keep the operation running between now and then." "I can do that," he said. She was quiet again, that measuring quiet. "Pay is $1 a day plus board." "I cannot offer more than that right now." "That is acceptable," he said. She stood up from her chair and folded the harness over her arm and said, "Stow your horse in the barn. Pete will show you the bunkhouse." She was almost to the door when she stopped and said without turning around, "My daughter's name is Clara. She is 9. I would appreciate it if she is treated with courtesy." "Of course," Robert said. She nodded once and went inside, and Robert Bishop led his horse to the barn, thinking that he had just agreed to work for a woman who was carrying about 10,000 pounds of trouble on a frame that looked as though it had been built for exactly that purpose. The first week was all work and very little conversation. Robert walked every fence line on the property and made a list of what needed repair, and went to work on it with Pete Dawson, who turned out to be exactly what Inez had described, capable and deliberate and slightly slower than the situation required. Kobe Sutton was eager to prove himself and followed Robert around with the energy of a young dog, absorbing information and asking good questions when he had them. Clara watched Robert from a careful distance. She had the manner of a child who has recently learned that the world can take things away without warning and has adjusted her expectations accordingly. She did not speak to him for the first 4 days, which he respected. On the 5th day she appeared at the fence where he was working and stood there until he acknowledged her. "Mama says you used to be a Texas Ranger," she said. "I did," he said, driving a staple into the post. "Did you shoot people?" "I enforced the law," he said carefully. "Sometimes that required a show of force." Clara considered this. "Did you like it?" He paused and looked at her. "Some parts of it," he said honestly. "Not all of it." She nodded as though this was a satisfactory answer and went back to the house. The conversation at supper that evening was the most he and Inez had exchanged in a single setting. She served the meal herself, a good beef stew with biscuits, and they sat at the kitchen table with Clara between them, and Robert told her about the fence repairs he had completed and what remained, and she listened without interrupting and asked several sharp, specific questions that demonstrated she understood the property better than many men he had worked for understood theirs. "The north pasture fence was the worst of it," he said. "2 sections need full replacement, not just patching. I can have it done by end of week if the weather holds." "Good," she said. "What about the stock?" "They need better grazing. The east pasture has been overgrazed. If you can move them to the creek pasture for the next 3 weeks, they will put on enough condition to bring a decent price." She was quiet for a moment. "Daniel always kept them on the east side because it was easier to manage from the barn." "It's easier for the management," Robert said, "but hard on the cattle. Creek pasture will take more moving, but the grass is better." She looked at him steadily and then nodded. "Move them." It was a small thing, agreeing with his assessment about the cattle. But he noticed that she did it without resentment and without false modesty, and that was the mark of a woman who wanted the right answer more than she wanted to be the one who had it. He thought about that for longer than he intended to. Harlan Goode appeared at the ranch on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of Robert's employment, arriving in a fine black buggy with a man named Chester Ames riding alongside on a big roan. Chester was Goode's enforcer in the most polite sense of the word, a thick-necked man who did not appear to do much except be large and present in an ominous manner. Robert was working on the barn roof when they arrived and watched from above as Goode descended from the buggy and went to the house and knocked. Inez answered the door. Robert could not hear the conversation, but he could see the set of her shoulders, which went from their usual upright composure to something slightly more rigid, the way a plank bows under weight. He came down from the roof when Goode's buggy left 20 minutes later. He found Inez in the barn, ostensibly checking on a lame mare but actually standing with one hand against the stall post and the other pressed flat to her abdomen the way people press on a wound. "Trouble?" he asked. She turned around with her composure already back in place, which told him it had been a deliberate act, the recovering of it. "Harlan Goode holds a note on this property. It comes due in 5 weeks. How much?" "Just over $500. He ran the calculation in his head. 63 head of cattle, give or take, at the prices Carl had mentioned. It was close but possible if the market held. "The drive should cover it," he said. "If the market holds," she said, which told him she had run the same calculation. "And if we can get to Wichita without any losses." "That is manageable," he said. Goode offered again to take the deed as payment, she said. Her voice was flat and controlled. "He says it would save me the trouble of the drive." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I would have his money in 5 weeks. She said it with a quiet ferocity that was not loud but was very deep, the kind of ferocity that does not make speeches but simply does not move. Robert Bishop had met men who talked about courage the way people talk about the weather, frequently and with little personal investment. He had met a handful who actually possessed it. He recognized it now, standing in the stall of a tired mare in a barn in Kansas, in the voice of a woman who had been offered an easy way out and had declined it without drama. "Then we had better make sure the cattle are ready," he said. She looked at him as though she had expected something else, some comment on the difficulty of her situation or some well-meaning advice about being reasonable, and instead he had offered her exactly what she wanted, which was for someone to treat her decision as already made and worth honoring. Something shifted very slightly in her expression, a fraction of the weight behind her eyes redistributing itself. "Yes," she said, "we had better." The weeks that followed were the kind that reveal character the way fire reveals the composition of metal. They worked from before sunrise until after dark, all 4 of them, with Clara helping where she was able and proving herself considerably more useful than her 9 years suggested. The cattle were moved to the creek pasture, and they began to fill out visibly, which gave everyone a lift of genuine optimism. 2 new fence sections went up on the north boundary. The lame mare recovered under Pete Dawson's careful attention. Robert found himself falling into a rhythm with the ranch, and with its inhabitants that he had not expected and was not entirely sure what to do with. He ate supper at the house most evenings, because Inez had extended the invitation in the manner of a practical woman who saw no reason to cook twice when once would serve, and these meals became the best part of his day, which was information he kept strictly to himself. Clara was warming to him in gradual stages, the way a cat warms to a new person in a house, offering slightly more of herself each time until the distance between them had closed without either of them seeming to have moved. She had a dry, unexpected sense of humor for a 9-year-old, and a habit of asking questions that cut directly to the heart of a matter. She asked him one evening why he had left the Rangers, and he said it was because the law was complicated and he had needed a rest from its complications. And she thought about this and said, "Is the law complicated, or are the people who break it complicated?" And he had to sit with that for a moment before answering. He was sitting with a great many things those weeks. He was sitting, specifically, with the fact that he watched Inez Whitaker move through her days with an attentiveness that was becoming harder to attribute solely to professional interest. He noticed the way she pushed a strand of dark hair from her forehead when she was reading. He noticed that she laughed more than he had expected, a genuine sound, not polished or performed, that appeared suddenly and disappeared quickly as though she was not quite sure she had the right to it. He noticed that she was unfailingly honest with him, that she never softened bad news or inflated good prospects, and that this honesty, in a country and a time that often treated women as though they needed protection from the truth, was remarkable. He did not say any of these things. He was very careful not to say any of these things. She was a widow of 2 months, and she was his employer, and the situation was precarious enough without him complicating it. But he brought her coffee one morning when she had been awake since before dawn going over numbers at the kitchen table, and she looked up when he set the cup down and said, "Thank you, Robert," using his first name for the first time, and the sound of it in her voice sat warmly in his chest all day. On the night before the drive was to begin, a problem arrived in the form of Chester Ames, who came to the ranch alone after dark on a Saturday evening. Robert was in the bunkhouse and heard the horse and came out to find Ames on horseback at the edge of the yard, not approaching the house but not leaving either, just sitting there in the dark in the way that a large stationary man is designed to be unsettling. "Something I can help you with," Robert said. Ames looked him over with the slow deliberation of a man who has been hired specifically for his ability to make other men uncomfortable. "Just letting Mrs. Whitaker know that Mr. Goode is still interested in resolving things amicably," he said. "She knows how to find him if she needs him," Robert said. "Riding out here after dark isn't necessary. Mr. Goode likes to be thorough." "So do I," Robert said, and let that sit there for a moment in the dark between them, not a threat, just a statement of fact, delivered in the tone of a man who does not make threats because he does not feel the need to. "Ride back to town, Chester. You'll be more comfortable in bed." Ames looked at him for a long moment and then turned his horse without another word and rode back down the lane toward the road. Robert watched him go and stayed in the yard until the sound of hoofbeats had died completely before he went back inside. He did not tell Inez about it that night. He told her in the morning over breakfast, plainly and without drama, before the drive preparations began. She listened with her hands around her coffee cup and her eyes steady. "He is trying to rattle me," she said. "He is," Robert agreed. "I wanted you to know." "Was he alone?" "Yes," she nodded. "Good. If he had brought others, that would have been a different situation." She looked out the kitchen window toward the barn where Pete and Kobe were already moving. "Thank you for being there." "It's what I'm here for," he said. She looked at him then with something in her eyes that was more than gratitude and less than the full thing she was not saying, a middle distance of emotion that he recognized because he was occupying the same territory himself. And then she set down her cup and said, "We should get moving," and they both stood up. The drive to Wichita was 4 days, which was not long as drives went but was long enough for a great many things to happen, and a great many conversations to occur that would not have occurred on either side of it. They took 61 cattle, having left 2 behind for reasons of soundness, plus the horses and the 4 of them, with Clara left in the care of Mrs. Agnes Hartwell, a neighbor and widow herself, who lived 3 miles to the east and had known Daniel Whitaker for 20 years. Clara had accepted this arrangement with her characteristic solemnity, hugging her mother tight in the yard with her eyes shut, and then releasing her with a nod that was heartbreakingly adult. "I'll be fine," Clara told her mother. "I know how to help Mrs. Hartwell." "I know you do," Inez said and kissed her forehead. 4 days. 4 days, Clara agreed, and went to find her bag. The first day of the drive was all movement and noise, and the particular organized chaos of getting cattle onto a road and keeping them there. Robert managed the point, Kobe rode swing, and Pete handled drag with the experience of a man who has done it so many times that the dust no longer bothers him. Inez rode alongside and proved within the first 2 hours that she was a competent horsewoman who did not need to be told where to be. They made camp that first night beside a creek with good water, and after supper Pete and Kobe fell asleep with the promptness of very tired men, and Robert and Inez sat for a while by the fire with the cattle settled nearby and the Kansas sky above them, which was enormous and full of stars in a way that was almost too much, as though the universe was trying to make a point. "What made you decide to run the ranch after Daniel died?" he asked. Not prying, just the kind of question that comes naturally in the dark beside a fire when someone has worked alongside you for 3 weeks and you want to understand them better. She was quiet for a moment, watching the fire. "It was ours," she said. Mine and Daniel's and Clara's. We built it from nothing. We came out here in '73 with $300 and a wagon and a dog that died the first winter. A small pause. I am not going to hand it to Harlan Goode because I am alone now. That is not how Daniel would have wanted it, and it is not what I want. Was it difficult? He said carefully, coming out here in '73. Every year was difficult, she said, and there was no self-pity in it. The first winter, the drought in '75, the market crashed the year after, but we managed. Every time we thought it was going to break us, we managed. She looked into the fire. Daniel was a good partner. He listened to me. A lot of men don't. Were you happy? He asked, and then immediately felt the presumptuousness of the question, but she did not seem to take it amiss. Yes, she said simply. Very. Not perfectly, because nothing is, but genuinely. She turned her head and looked at him with a directness that was becoming familiar. What about you? Have you been happy? He thought about it honestly, which was what her directness seemed to require. In pieces, he said. There were years that were good. The ranger work was satisfying when it was straightforward, which it wasn't often enough. Why did you really leave? He had given Clara the shorter answer. He gave Inez the longer one because she seemed to warrant it. A man I thought was guilty turned out not to be, he said. I had put a considerable amount of effort into building the case against him. When it fell apart, 2 other men who were guilty walked free because we had been looking at the wrong person. He lost 2 years of his life to suspicion, and those 2 years couldn't be given back. He paused. I found I couldn't continue doing work where those kinds of errors were possible, and I was the one making them. She looked at him for a long time. That sounds like a good reason, she said. It also sounds like a convenient story, he said with a rueful half-smile. You just told me the inconvenient version, she said. Give yourself some credit. He laughed, which surprised him, and she smiled at the surprise on his face. And it was such a genuine and unguarded moment between them that they both felt it, and then both, with a kind of mutual consideration, let it settle into silence before it became something that needed addressing. The second day was harder, with the cattle more restless in the heat, and a section of road that was badly rutted from spring wagon traffic. And Robert and Kobe spent 2 hours moving a stubborn bunch of steers who had decided they preferred the ditch to the road. And by evening, everyone was tired in that good specific way that comes from real physical work. It was Pete Dawson who said something that evening that lodged itself in Robert's thinking. They were checking the horses before sleep, and Pete, who had said very little to Robert on any personal subject, said with his eyes on his horse's fetlock, Mrs. Whitaker is a fine woman. She is, Robert agreed. Daniel was a good man, Pete said. He worked hard and he treated people fairly. She needs someone like that. He stood up from the fetlock and looked at Robert with the uncomplicated directness of a man who says what he means without ornament. That's all I'm saying. Robert said nothing, and Pete walked back to his bedroll, and Robert stood in the dark with his horse for a while before he did the same. They reached the outskirts of Wichita on the 4th afternoon and drove the cattle to the yards on the south side of the city, which smelled the way cattle yards always smell, which is to say considerably worse than anything that is polite to describe. The buyer was a man named Simmons, a broad fellow with a red face and a manner that was professional without being warm, and he walked the cattle with Robert and Inez in the late afternoon sun, while the city of Wichita went about its business around them with the cheerful indifference of a place that has seen 10,000 cattle and 10,000 drovers, and is not going to be moved by any particular combination. The negotiation took an hour. Simmons started low, which was expected, and Inez countered with a figure that was firm and accurate, citing the condition of the animals with the fluency of someone who has spent 6 weeks preparing them specifically for this moment. And Robert stood at her shoulder and occasionally confirmed a specific detail when she looked to him for it, but she did not need much confirmation. She knew her cattle. They settled at a price that was $20 below what Robert had hoped for and $30 above what he had feared, which came to $480 after all fees. Close, but not quite enough for the full note plus interest. Inez did the arithmetic in her head in the time it took Simmons to write out the receipt. Robert watched her do it and watched the moment when she arrived at the same number he had. "It comes up short," she said quietly to him as Simmons went to fetch his ledger. "By about $30, Robert said, "plus any incidentals on the ride back." She looked ahead at the cattle being penned and was very still for a moment. Then she straightened her shoulders in that particular way she had and turned to Robert and said, "Do you know where I can sell a horse in Wichita?" He looked at her. "Your horse? I have two at home, Callie and the mare that recovered. I only need one." She met his eyes with an expression that said she had made the calculation completely and was at peace with it. "The road home is 4 days. I can ride Kobe's spare." "Inez," he said, and stopped because he had used her first name without planning to, and it had come out with a different weight than intended. She registered this, the use of her name and the weight in it, and something moved in her expression. "It is just a horse," she said. "I know," he said. "I know it is." He paid the $32 himself, from the money belt he wore under his shirt, counted it out and handed it to her in the dusty yard outside the cattle pens with Pete and Kobe at a discreet distance loading the remaining supplies. She looked at the money and then at him, and the expression on her face was not the surprised gratitude of someone receiving charity. It was something more complicated and more considered than that, the expression of a woman recalibrating. "I will pay you back," she said. "Every cent. There is no hurry," he said. "There is for me," she said. He nodded because he understood that completely. "Then pay me back when the ranch is clear of debt and not before," he said. "That is the arrangement." She looked at the money in her hand and then folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, not in the way of a woman fishing for a declaration, but in the genuine way of a woman who needs an honest answer. He thought about it for a moment and then said, "Because you are not going to lose that ranch. Not to Harlan Goode and not to a $30 shortfall." He paused, "And because I have the money and you need it, that is sufficient reason." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had ridden onto her property 6 weeks ago with a string of horses and a quiet reputation, who had repaired her fences and moved her cattle and sat beside her fire and told her the truth about himself when she asked for it. She looked at him with eyes that had been measuring and careful and now were something else, something that still held its composure but had opened a door inside it that she was not sure she had meant to open. "Thank you, Robert," she said. "You are welcome, Inez," he said. They rode back to Wichita that evening and Inez went to the bank while Robert got them rooms at a boarding house on 2nd Street. And she paid the money in person to Harlan Goode's Wichita representative, who was a nervous young man in a too-large suit who seemed surprised to see her and who counted the bills 3 times before issuing her a receipt. And when she walked out of that office with the receipt in her hand, she stood for a moment on the boardwalk of Wichita in the mild April evening and took what might have been the first completely free breath she had drawn since Daniel died. Robert was waiting outside with the horses. He did not ask how it had gone because the answer was on her face. He just said, "Supper," and she said yes with the small genuine smile that appeared and disappeared quickly as though she was not sure she was allowed it, and they walked down 2nd Street to a restaurant that was not much but was warm and decent, and the two of them had the first meal that was not driven by exhaustion or necessity. Just 2 people sitting across a table in the early evening. Pete and Kobe had gone to a different establishment, as young men and older men tend to prefer different entertainments, and so it was just Inez and Robert, and the conversation that had been building for 6 weeks in the spaces between work and supper and campfire and cattle, the conversation that neither of them had been quite ready to have, came out with the ease of something that has been held back a long time and is finally allowed to move. He told her about growing up in Virginia before the war, which had ended when he was 18 and had taken his older brother. He told her about coming west afterward because the East had too many things in it that hurt to see. He told her about the drives and the Rangers and the 2 years in San Antonio that ended badly, though he told that part briefly and without detail, simply that there had been a woman who had not wanted the life he offered and had been right to say so, and that he had been angry about it for longer than made sense and was now past it. She told him about Missouri, where she had grown up on a farm with 2 brothers and a mother who was the most competent person she had ever known. She had married Daniel at 22 and followed him to Kansas at 25 because he had the dream and the willingness, and she had the sense to know that a dream shared is a more viable thing than a dream held alone. She said this without sentimentality, as a factual description of a decision she was glad she had made. "Do you regret coming?" he asked. "Not for a single day," she said. "Even the hard ones. The land out here does something to a person. It makes you honest. You cannot pretend things are different than they are when there is nothing between you and the horizon." He understood this completely. It was more or less why he had come west himself. They walked back to the boarding house through streets that were quieter than they would have been in the summer, the cattle drive season not yet in full swing, and the night air had the particular sweetness of a Kansas spring, clean and cool, and carrying the smell of grass from somewhere beyond the buildings. At the door of the house, she turned to say good night and paused. "I am glad you came to the ranch," she said. He looked at her in the lamplight that fell through the boarding house window, her dark hair loose at the ends where the day's riding had undone her pins, her face open in the way it was rarely completely open, the composure present but not deployed, and he felt the full weight of what was happening between them with a clarity that was both welcome and slightly terrifying. "So am I," he said. There was a moment that could have been the beginning of something more immediate, but neither of them moved into it. They were both people who moved with deliberation, who gave things the time they needed. She said goodnight and went inside, and Robert stood on the porch of a Wichita boarding house looking at the stars that were enormous above the flat Kansas sky, and thought about the fact that he had 32 fewer dollars than he'd had that morning, and was entirely at peace with this. The ride home took 4 days in the mild spring weather, and was in every way more comfortable than the drive south had been. The cattle were sold and the note was paid and the immediate crisis was resolved, and what expanded into that space was a kind of lightness that all 4 of them felt, including Pete, who allowed himself several remarks of dry humor that no one had heard from him before. On the second evening, camped near the same creek where they had stopped on the way south, Robert and Inez sat again beside the fire, and this time there was no urgency pressing on the conversation, and so it went deeper and stayed longer. He asked her what she intended to do with the ranch now that it was clear. "Build it up properly," she said without hesitation. "The herd was at 120 head when Daniel was at his best. We fell back because of 2 hard winters. I want to be at that number again by end of next year. You will need more hands," he said. "I know." She watched the fire. "Will you stay?" The question was asked in the tone of an employer to an employee, carefully calibrated to be businesslike, but there was something beneath it that was neither of those things, and they both knew it. He was quiet for a moment. "I would like to," he said, which was not the same as saying yes but was closer to the full truth, which included things he was not yet prepared to say in their entirety. She looked at him sidelong in the firelight. "That is not quite an answer," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not." "What is the rest of it?" He was a man who did not speak carelessly, and so he was quiet again for a moment, organizing the rest of it. "I do not want to stay simply as a hired hand," he said at last. "I find that arrangement is becoming complicated in a way that would not be fair to you if it remained unacknowledged." She was very still. The fire popped and settled. Around them the night insects of Kansas spoke their patient language. "Complicated how?" she asked, and her voice was steady but not by accident. "I have a great deal of respect for you," he said. "That is not complicated. But the rest of what I have found myself thinking, over the past several weeks, is more than respect." He looked at her directly because she deserved directness. "I am telling you this not because I expect anything from it, but because I am not a man who is comfortable with dishonesty, and pretending otherwise would be a form of it." She held his gaze for a long time. The firelight moved on her face, He could see the working of her thoughts as she let herself feel the full meaning of what he had said, and the working of something beneath the thoughts that she was similarly honest with herself about. Daniel has been gone for 2 months, she said. I know. I am not sure I know what I feel about that, she said. About myself, about whether it is. She stopped. I do not wish to dishonor his memory. I do not want you to either, he said. And I am not asking you to decide anything. I only wanted to be honest with you about where I am. You can do with that whatever is right for you. She looked into the fire for a long time without speaking. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and careful and very honest. I think about you, she said. At the end of the day, when everything is quiet, I have found myself. She stopped again. I think about you. He did not reach for her hand. He did not close the distance between them on the log where they sat. He simply nodded and said, "Thank you for telling me," and meant it entirely, and they sat beside the fire for another hour talking about ordinary things, the cattle and the fence and what Pete might say if they told him they were adding to the herd, and the comfort of sitting beside someone who has said something true and has been met with equivalent truth, was so enormous and so quiet that neither of them tried to put a name on it yet. They arrived back at the ranch on a warm Thursday afternoon to find Clara waiting on the porch with Mrs. Hartwell, who was a stout, cheerful woman with strong opinions about everything and the good sense to keep most of them to herself unless asked. Clara came off the porch at a run and embraced her mother with the full force of a 9-year-old's suppressed anxiety, and Inez held her hard and long, and Robert watched from horseback with a feeling in his chest that was not quite describable in the language available to him at that moment. He stayed. Of course he stayed. There was no real question about it after Wichita, and the work was there and the summer was beginning and the ranch needed him, and all of these were true and also beside the point. June brought long days and good weather and a new rhythm at the Whitaker ranch that was different from the anxious, survival-driven rhythm of May. Inez bought 6 new cattle with a portion of the drive money, and Robert acquired 2 more horses at a fair price from a man coming through on the Kishome, and by the middle of the month, the ranch was beginning to look like what it was working to become rather than what it had nearly ceased to be. Harlan Goode appeared once more, on a Saturday at the end of June, again with Chester Ames. He arrived just as Robert was coming in from the east pasture, and this time he waited in the yard for someone to come out rather than going to the door, and something about this told Robert that Goode had modified his tactics. Inez came out of the house herself and stood on the porch steps with her arms crossed in a manner that was not unfriendly but was absolutely final. "Mr. Goode," she said. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, touching his hat. His eyes moved to Robert and back. "I heard the note was paid. Congratulations." "Thank you," she said. "I wanted to let you know that I have acquired the Morrison place on the eastern side of your property," Goode said, and his voice was smooth and conversational, the voice of a man delivering news he knows is not news to him. "As neighbors, I expect we will have a great deal to discuss going forward." The Morrison place was a section of 300 acres that shared a long fence line with the Whitaker East pasture. Inez's expression did not change. "I look forward to having a good neighbor," she said, in the tone of a woman who does not believe she is about to have a good neighbor. Goode smiled and tipped his hat and rode away with Chester Ames at his heel, and Robert went to stand at the base of the porch steps and looked up at Inez. "He is going to fence the water," she said. Robert had been thinking the same thing. The Morrison place included the upper reach of the creek that fed the Whitaker pasture. It was a legal and entirely effective way to pressure a neighbor without a direct confrontation. "We need to establish your water rights before he can act," Robert said. "I know," she said. "Daniel registered the water claim in '68 when we first arrived, but I need to find the paperwork." "Then we find it tonight," he said. They found it that night in the bottom drawer of Daniel's roll-top desk. A folded document on yellowed paper that was exactly what she needed. A registered prior claim on the creek water established before any other neighbor had made a claim, which in the legal framework of the period gave her the right to continued use. Robert read it twice and confirmed what he understood of water law from his ranger days, which was enough to be confident. "Take this to the county office in Caldwell Monday morning and register the claim in your own name," he said. "Have the clerk note the transfer and the date. Goode cannot touch the water if this is properly registered in your name." She took the document from him and held it with both hands, and something passed across her face that was relief and grief at once, because it was Daniel's writing on the paper, Daniel's claim, and taking it into her own name was one more step across the threshold of the life she was building alone, and it was both necessary and painful. "All right," she said. "I can come with you," he said. "If you want a witness." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "please come." Monday morning, they rode to Caldwell together and went to the county clerk's office, which smelled of paper and ink and old decisions. And Inez presented the document and her identity, and the clerk, a precise man named Hadley, registered the water claim in the name of Inez Whitaker with a date of June the 23rd, 1879, and she and Robert signed as principal and witness respectively, and when they walked back out into the summer morning, Harlan Goode was across the street outside his bank watching them from the boardwalk, with an expression that was difficult to read from a distance, but was certainly not pleased. He could not touch the water. Without the water, the Morrison land adjacent to her property was considerably less useful as leverage. Inez walked to her horse and Robert walked beside her, and she said quietly without looking at him, "Thank you. You did the work," he said. "You thought of it," she said. "We both thought of it," he said, and she laughed a small, real laugh, and Robert Bishop, who had come to Caldwell, Kansas with a string of horses and no intention of being moved by anything, found himself completely unable to remember why that had seemed like a reasonable plan. It was Clara who moved the situation forward in the way that children sometimes do, with the blunt, honest instrument of their affection. She had been watching Robert for months with those solemn brown eyes, absorbing and cataloging, and one evening in late July, she appeared in the kitchen where Robert was helping Inez put up the last of the supper things, which had become a habit between them as comfortable and companionable as an old coat, and Clara said, "Mr. Bishop, do you like our ranch?" "I do," he said. "Do you like our family?" she asked, and there was such straightforward weight on the word family that Inez stopped what she was doing with a plate in her hand. Robert crouched down to be at eye level with Clara, which he had learned early was the appropriate way to speak with her about serious things. "I like your family very much," he said. Clara looked at him with the directness that was her primary feature. "Mama smiles more since you came," she said. "She used to only do it for us." "Clara," Inez said, somewhere between reproach and the inability to call something untrue. "It is a good thing," Clara said, with the mild exasperation of a 9-year-old who feels she is making a simple point that the adults are overcomplicating. "I am just saying it is a good thing." Robert stood up and looked at Inez, who was looking at the plate in her hands with a faint color on her cheeks that was entirely becoming and that she was clearly not entirely comfortable with, and he said, "She makes some very good points." "She generally does," Inez said, still looking at the plate. "Inez," he said. She looked up at him. "Would you walk with me after Clara is in bed?" he asked. "I would like to talk with you." She looked at him for a moment, and then said yes with a quietness that was not small but very large, the quietness of something opening. Clara went to bed without her usual campaign of delays, which Robert suspected was not entirely coincidental, and when he and Inez walked out into the July evening, the sky was still faintly light at the western edge, and the air carried the smell of warm grass and the creek, and the particular fullness of a summer night in Kansas. They walked toward the creek pasture along the fence line, not quickly, the way people walk when the destination is not the point. He had thought about what he wanted to say but had decided not to plan it too carefully because, with Inez, who valued directness, the spontaneous, honest version would serve better than the rehearsed one. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that whatever your answer is, I intend to stay and keep my word to this place, and to you, and to Clara." She was looking ahead at the fence line, but he could see her jaw set slightly in the way it set when she was holding herself very still for an important thing. "I have been here 3 months," he said, "and I have worked alongside you and eaten at your table and sat beside your fire, and I have found that the prospect of leaving, of going anywhere that is not here, has become essentially unthinkable." He stopped walking and she stopped beside him. "I know the timing is not conventional. I know 2 months of widowhood is a short time, and I am not asking you to call it anything today. But I wanted to ask you plainly whether you think there is a future here, for both of us, not just for the ranch." She was quiet for long enough that he heard the creek and the distant cattle and a night bird somewhere in the dark willows. Then she turned to face him, and in the last of the evening light, her face had the openness it only had completely when she had decided to let it. "When I was standing in Harlan Goode's bank representative's office in Wichita," she said, "paying the note on my property which I would not have been able to pay without you, I thought about what Daniel would have said about you." She paused. "He would have liked you. He would have said you are a man who does things for the right reasons and doesn't make noise about it. He would have said that is rare." Robert listened carefully. "I am not ready to call it anything today," she said. "You are right about that. But I am telling you that there is no version of my future that I can see clearly that does not include you in it." She met his eyes. "That is my plain answer." He nodded slowly. "That is enough," he said. "That is more than enough." They stood there for a moment in the summer dark with the whole of the ranch around them and the creek running its patient way through the grass and the stars arriving one by one overhead. And he reached out and took her hand, just her hand, held it in both of his, and she did not pull away but stood quietly with the warmth of it, and it was a small thing and a very large thing all at once. The summer deepened, and the thing between them deepened with it, gradually and honestly, in the way of two people who have been through enough to know the value of not rushing the things that matter. They spent their evenings together on the porch or beside the fire, talking about the ranch and the cattle and Clara and their respective pasts, and the talking built something between them that was as solid as the fence lines Robert kept repaired, a structure of shared understanding. He kissed her for the first time on an evening in August, standing on the back porch after a long day of cattle work, when she had made some dry observation about the character of one of the steers, and he had laughed and the laughter had turned into a look at each other that needed answering, and he had cupped her face in his hands and kissed her with all the care and intention of a man who does not do things carelessly. She kissed him back with equal intention, which told him everything he needed to know. Clara, who appeared in the kitchen window approximately 11 seconds later with the air of someone who had not been looking, asked at breakfast the next morning whether Robert was going to marry her mother, and they both choked on their coffee. "Clara," Inez said. "I am asking a reasonable question," Clara said. "Are you?" Robert looked at Inez over the table, and Inez was very pink and very composed simultaneously, which was a remarkable combination, and he said to Clara, "That is between your mother and me." "You are talking to the wrong person then," Clara said, and went back to her biscuit with complete serenity. That evening Robert went to find Inez at the end of her day, when she was sitting on the porch with her account book open and the early September air carrying the first suggestion of the coming fall, and he stood at the porch rail and said without preamble, "Clara asked me this morning if I was going to marry you." Inez looked up from the account book. "I know," she said. "She told me." "I want to answer her," he said. She closed the account book slowly. "What answer do you want to give her?" "The true one," he said, "which is yes if you will have me." She looked at him across the porch in the evening light. This woman who had buried her husband and faced down a banker and driven 60 head of cattle to Wichita and come home and kept her land and built her herd back up and done all of it with a composure and a courage that he had spent the summer learning the full dimensions of. She looked at him and he could see every layer of the decision in her eyes, the grief that was real and present and would not disappear, the practicality that was part of how she navigated everything, and beneath both of those things, large and warm and steady, what she actually felt. "Yes," she said, "I will." He crossed the porch in 2 steps and took her hands in his and pulled her up from the chair and held her there, and she let her forehead rest briefly against his shoulder with the movement of someone finally setting down something very heavy, and he held her with one arm and kept her hands in his other and said her name quietly against her hair. "Inez." "I know," she said. "I know." They told Clara at supper that evening, and Clara received the news with the thoughtful gravity that characterized all her important emotional moments and then said, "I would like to call you something other than Mr. Bishop. May I call you Robert?" "You may call me whatever you like," he said. She considered it. "I will call you Robert for now," she said, "and decide about the rest later." He said that was perfectly fair. Harlan Goode was not finished, as Inez had known he would not be. He had a way of not being finished that was persistent without ever quite crossing into the openly confrontational, which made him considerably more difficult to deal with than a man who simply acted badly and could be dealt with accordingly. In September, he appeared at the ranch with his lawyer, a man named Alistair Fenn from Dodge City, who had spectacles and a precisely trimmed mustache, and the manner of someone who had been hired to find technical objections to things. Fenn presented Inez with a document alleging that the original deed to the Whitaker ranch had an error in the boundary description that affected 40 acres on the north side, which coincidentally happened to be the 40 acres through which the water supply for the north pasture ran. Inez took the document and read it carefully while Goode stood in her yard with the patient expression of a man who has been waiting a long time for a particular move to become available to him. She handed it back without expression. "I will have my response to your lawyer within the week," she said. After they left, she brought the document to Robert and they sat at the kitchen table and read it together, and then Robert said, "This is legitimate legal action. He has found a genuine discrepancy. The deed description doesn't match the survey markers." "I know," she said. "We need a lawyer," she nodded. "There is a man named David Cole in Caldwell. He does property work. Daniel used him twice." "Go to him tomorrow," Robert said. "We will go tomorrow," she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the document with the same expression she had brought to every crisis since he had known her, clear and direct and entirely without self-pity. He loved her. He had known it for a while with increasing certainty, but in this particular moment it arrived with the completeness of something that has been approaching for a long time and has now arrived. "Inez," he said. She looked up. "You are not going to lose this ranch," he said. "I want you to hear that. Whatever Goode tries, you are not going to lose it." She looked at him with something in her eyes that was past measurement. "I know," she said. "I know because you are here." They went to David Cole the next morning, who was a lean, quiet man in his 40s with a precise understanding of Kansas land law and a complete contempt for Harlan Goode that he expressed only through the slight thinning of his lips when the name was mentioned. He examined the deed and the survey and Goode's document for an hour while Robert and Inez sat in his office. "The discrepancy is real," Cole said at last, "but the remedy is a survey correction, not a deed dispute. The actual boundaries have been occupied and used continuously by the Whitakers since '63, which establishes clear possession. Goode cannot claim the land on the basis of a clerical error in an old description when 16 years of continuous occupation make the intent entirely clear." "He knows that," Inez said. "He does," Cole agreed. "This is a nuisance action. He is hoping the cost of defending it will make you more amenable to selling." He looked at Inez over his spectacles with a dry respect. "I presume you are not more amenable." "No," Inez said. "Then I will file the response today," Cole said. "The survey correction will take 3 weeks and cost you $11. Goode will withdraw when he sees it going nowhere." He was right. 3 weeks later, the survey was corrected and the deed reissued with accurate boundary descriptions in the name of Inez Whitaker, and Goode's lawyer sent a brief note saying the matter was resolved, and that was the last legal action Harlan Goode attempted against the Whitaker ranch. It was not the last time they saw him. He would remain a neighbor of a sort for years, the Morrison land changing hands twice more before Inez eventually bought it herself. But from that autumn onward, he treated her with the chilly respect of a man who has tested something repeatedly and found it does not give. They were married on the 14th of October, 1879, in the parlor of the Whitaker ranch house, with the minister from Caldwell and Pete Dawson and Kobe Sutton and Agnes Hartwell as witnesses, and Clara standing beside her mother in a new dress that Inez had sewn in the weeks prior, looking at the proceedings with an expression of complete satisfaction. The ceremony was simple and serious, which suited both of them. When the minister said the words and Robert spoke his vows, he spoke them in the direct and unhurried way he did everything that mattered, looking at Inez with the steady gray eyes that she had spent months learning to read and had come to trust absolutely. And when she spoke her own vows, she did it with the composure that was her native language, but with something entirely genuine behind it, like light through a very clear glass. When the minister pronounced them married, Clara immediately went to Robert and took his hand and said, "Now can I call you something other than Robert?" "What would you like to call me?" he asked. She considered it with great seriousness. "I will call you Pa," she said, "if that is acceptable to you." He had not expected that, and it showed on his face for a moment before his composure caught up, and Pete Dawson, who was not a demonstrative man, made a sound in the back of his throat that was approximately the sound of a man's eyes watering for reasons unconnected to dust. Robert crouched down to Clara's level and said, "That is more than acceptable to me. That would make me very glad." Clara nodded as though this had been correctly decided, and went to find the cake that Agnes Hartwell had brought, because practical celebration was also in her nature. Inez watched this exchange from 2 feet away and felt something that was not one thing but many things layered together, grief and love and gratitude, and the complicated specific happiness of a life that has had real loss in it and has kept going and found, against reasonable expectation, that it has been given something extraordinary. Robert stood up from his crouch and came to stand beside her, and she took his arm without ceremony, which was how she did everything, and they stood together in the parlor of the ranch house she had built from nothing with a man she had loved well and buried with sorrow, and a man she had come to love differently and equally, and the afternoon sun came through the west windows and lay in long warm bands across the floor. The first winter of their marriage was the winter Robert learned the full depth of what he had come into. He had known it in pieces through the summer and fall, the practical ability of the woman, the precision of her management, the quality of her character. But winter on a Kansas ranch in 1879 was its own education, and they moved through it together, the long cold days and the short dark evenings, with a closeness that was built from proximity and shared work, and also from the deliberate choice to keep building the understanding between them. Clara proved herself a child worth knowing through that winter, which Robert had suspected and now confirmed. She was reading at a level years above her age, and had opinions about what she read, and wanted to discuss them at supper with a seriousness that was sometimes almost funny and always genuine. She was also practical in the way her mother was practical, appearing at the barn on cold mornings to help with feeding before anyone asked her, learning to make bread because she had decided she wanted to know, completing her schoolwork with the focused efficiency of someone who views education as a tool rather than an obligation. One evening in December, with snow pressing against the windows and the fire high, and all three of them in the sitting room with their respective occupations, Clara reading and Inez mending and Robert working on a piece of tack that needed replacing, Clara looked up from her book and said, "Are we going to get bigger?" Both adults looked at her. "The family," Clara said. "Are we going to get bigger?" Inez looked at Robert and Robert looked at Inez, and something passed between them that was both a look and a conversation, and also an acknowledgement of a thing they had discussed privately in the way of married people who have found their full ease with each other. "Perhaps someday," Inez said. "Good," Clara said and went back to her book. She was right, as she generally was. The spring of 1880 brought the first signs of that future, and Inez told Robert on an April morning that was exactly 1 year from the morning she had buried Daniel Whitaker, in the kitchen over coffee, with the same directness she brought to every important piece of information. "We are going to have a baby," she said. He set down his cup and looked at her. She was watching him with the open, careful expression she used when something mattered enormously. He stood up from the table and came around to where she was sitting and crouched beside her chair and took both her hands and said, "How are you feeling?" "Glad," she said. "A little frightened. Mostly glad." "I am very glad," he said. "More than I know how to say quickly," she laughed. "Then say it slowly," she said, "over the next few months." He did. He said it in every way available to him, through the attention he paid to how she was feeling and the things he took off her plate without being asked, and the way he looked at her across the room when she did not know he was looking, and through the things he said in the quiet hours of their shared life that were not speeches but were true. Clara received the news with characteristic practicality, and said she hoped it was a brother, because she already knew about sisters from books and a brother seemed more interesting. The baby arrived in November of 1880, a boy, as Clara had requested, in an event that took 16 hours and cost Inez a great deal of effort and composure, and cost Robert the better part of his equanimity standing outside the bedroom door while Agnes Hartwell served as midwife. When Agnes finally opened the door and said, "Healthy boy," with a smile, Robert walked in to find Inez exhausted and luminous in the way only particular moments produce, holding a small, red-faced person who was making his objection to the world known loudly. He sat on the edge of the bed and she put the baby in his arms without ceremony, trusting him with it absolutely, and he held his son for the first time with the specific careful intentness of a man who understands the weight of what he is holding. "What shall we call him?" Inez asked. He had thought about this. "I would like to call him Daniel," he said, "if you are willing." She looked at him with eyes that were wet and steady simultaneously, that complicated mixture that was not sadness alone but something that honored the full truth of their family. "Yes," she said, "I think that is exactly right." Daniel James Bishop came into the world on November the 9th, 1880, in the upstairs bedroom of the Whitaker Ranch house in Caldwell County, Kansas, and was held by his father and his mother and his sister in turn, each of whom registered his arrival in their particular way. Clara examined him with scientific interest and declared him acceptably formed and went to tell Pete Dawson, who cried openly and appeared not to notice. The ranch grew through the early 1880s in the way that a well-run operation grows when it has good land and competent management, and enough people who care about it to keep it running properly. Robert and Inez brought the herd to 115 head by the spring of '82 and added a second bunkhouse to accommodate 2 additional hands, bringing the total to 4 with Kobe, who had grown from a green young man into a reliable foreman, and Pete, who had announced no intention of ever retiring. The water was secure, and the fences were maintained, and the hay yields were good in the years when the weather cooperated and manageable in the years when it did not. Harlan Goode sold his bank to a larger institution from Topeka in 1881 and moved to Colorado, which was not mourned by a significant number of people in Caldwell. Chester Ames found work on a ranch south of town, and by all accounts became a reasonable man once he was no longer employed to be an unreasonable one. David Cole handled the sale of the Morrison land to Inez in 1883, when the family that had bought it from Goode found themselves needing to sell quickly due to circumstances of their own. The price was fair, and she paid it in cash, which gave her a satisfaction that she did not feel the need to be dignified about. 300 additional acres, including the Upper Creek water that Goode had once intended to use against her, were now part of the Whitaker Bishop operation. She and Robert celebrated this purchase on the evening after the papers were signed by riding out together in the long summer evening to the far boundary of the new land, which was a stretch of rolling grass that moved in the wind like something breathing, and he sat on his horse beside her and she sat on hers, and they looked at the land that was theirs together. "We are going to need more cattle," she said. "I know," he said, smiling. "And another hand, probably." "I know. Kobe might want a raise." "He has earned one." She looked at the grass and then at him and smiled in the way she smiled sometimes that had no reserve in it at all. That was the full, unguarded version that he had been the recipient of for 3 years now and had not yet gotten over. "We did all right," she said. "We did better than all right," he said. Clara's education became a topic of some seriousness when she turned 12, because by then it was clear that she had a mind that warranted more than the available schooling in Caldwell, which reached only through the 6th reader. Inez wrote letters to schools in Topeka and received promising responses, and the family spent a long winter evening in the kitchen discussing the question with Clara's full participation, because Clara's full participation in decisions affecting her life had been the practice since she could speak. Clara was 14 when she went to school in Topeka, which required a conversation between her and her mother that was both practical and deeply emotional, and which Robert gave them the space to have by taking young Daniel, now 3 and full of opinions, to the barn for an extended examination of the horses. Clara departed on a stage in September of 1883 with a trunk and her books and her characteristic composed expression that slipped exactly once, when she embraced her mother goodbye, and then was restored before she turned to embrace Robert with the same fierceness. "You will write," she told him, which was an instruction rather than a request. "Every week," he promised. "And teach Daniel not to be afraid of the horses," she said. "He will need to ride properly." "He is not afraid of the horses," Robert said. "He is cautious. There is a difference." Clara considered this and decided it was correct. "All right," she said. "Every week." She got on the stage with the authority of someone who has decided what she is going to do and is doing it, and the stage rolled away into the September morning, and Robert stood beside Inez in the road and watched it go and felt the particular kind of pride and sorrow that is the specific property of parents watching their children go toward their futures. The second baby was a girl, born in the spring of 1884, with Inez's dark hair and Robert's gray eyes, and the lungs of someone who intended to be heard on the matter of her arrival. They named her Me, after Inez's mother, and Daniel, who was 3½ and had been prepared for this event with great care, examined her for a long moment after being allowed to hold her carefully on the kitchen settle, and then said she was smaller than the kittens in the barn, but he supposed she would get bigger, which Inez confirmed. Robert held me in the evening after Agnes had gone and Daniel was asleep, and the house had settled into its nighttime sounds, and he looked at his daughter with the same complete and quiet attention he had brought to his son 4 years before, and Inez, watching from the bed with the exhaustion and warmth that attended these moments, thought that this was the thing she had not known she needed when Robert Bishop had ridden into her yard, the quality of his attention to the things he loved, which was as steady and as sustaining as good water and good light. "Tell me what you are thinking," she said, because this was the question they asked each other, and it always yielded something worth having. He looked up from Me's face. "I am thinking about the morning I rode up to this house," he said. "What I expected, which was temporary work. What I did not expect, which was everything that happened after." "Are you glad?" she asked, echoing her own words from years past. "Inez," he said, in the tone of someone addressing a question so large that the answer barely fits in speech, "I am more glad than I have language for." She smiled. "Then say it slowly," she said, just as she had on that April morning 4 years ago, "over the rest of our lives." He looked at her with those gray eyes that she knew as well as the land, and he said, "I intend to." The years that followed were built from the same things that good lives are generally built from: love and work and difficulty and recovery, and the long, slow deepening of understanding between two people who have chosen each other fully and keep choosing each other every day. The ranch continued to grow. Daniel grew up to be a serious and practical boy who had, as Clara had predicted, no fear of horses once he was taught to understand them. He had his father's temperament and his mother's precision, and the particular combination produced a child who was steady without being slow and curious without being reckless. Clara returned from Topeka at 17, having decided she wanted to continue her education, and Inez and Robert supported this without hesitation, which in the Kansas of the 1880s was not the universal parental response to a daughter's academic ambitions, but was entirely consistent with how Inez Whitaker had conducted her life. Clara wrote home twice a week and visited for the summers, and brought with her a perspective on the wider world that expanded everyone at the dinner table. Me grew up in the way of a second child on a working ranch, which is to say with enormous confidence in her own opinions, and a complete lack of sentimentality about the practical realities of animal husbandry. She could ride before she could read and found the two activities equally necessary, and not much in need of explanation. Pete Dawson retired in 1886 and moved to Wichita to live with his daughter's family, and the leaving of him was harder than anyone had adequately prepared for. He had been present for every significant event in the life of the Whitaker Ranch since before Inez and Daniel had arrived, and the day he shook Robert's hand and climbed onto the stage was the day something fundamental passed from the ranch into memory. Inez wrote him letters until he died in 1890, and every one of them was answered. Kobe Sutton stayed, became foreman in fact as well as practice, married a woman from Caldwell named Ruth who was sensible and kind, and added a great deal to the social fabric of the operation. Their children appeared on the property with the frequency of an extended family, which is essentially what they were. The deed to the Whitaker Ranch, which had been the center of so much in those first hard months of 1879, hung in its frame in the front room of the house, reissued and corrected and registered in the names of Inez and Robert Bishop, the boundary lines accurate, the water claim established, the signatures of two people who had built a life from will and work, and the specific grace that comes when the right people find each other in time. Inez had put it there deliberately, not as a trophy but as a reminder, a piece of paper that had almost been surrendered and had not been, that stood for something about what it meant to hold on to the things worth holding. Sometimes in the evenings, when the house was full of the sounds of their family, Clara's voice on a visit home, or Daniel's footsteps on the stairs, or Me's laughter from wherever she had found to be, and the ranch outside the windows was running the way it ran when things were right, Robert would stand in the front room and look at that deed for a moment. He remembered Harlan Goode in the graveyard with his papers and his patience, waiting for a widow to give up what she had built. He remembered riding into the yard and finding her on the porch with her harness and her eyes full of a weight she was carrying entirely alone. He remembered Wichita and the campfire, and the moment she had said, "I think about you," in the dark beside the creek. He remembered the moment when they had stood in this very room and been married, and Clara had taken his hand, and the whole arc of it was so astonishing that he found it necessary to simply stand still for a moment and let it be true. Inez appeared in the doorway of the front room one evening in the autumn of 1888 and found him standing there looking at the deed, and she came to stand beside him in the way she had stood beside him for 9 years, close enough that their shoulders touched. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He looked at the deed and then at her. "That you almost gave this up," he said. "I never would have," she said. "I know," he said. "I know you never would have." He paused. "But I am glad I was here anyway." She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, which was a small gesture and one she had been making for 9 years, and it had not diminished in its meaning by a single degree. "So am I," she said. "Every single day." Outside, the Kansas autumn was doing what it always did, moving across the grassland with a cool and enormous indifference, the sky going big and orange at the edges the way it did in October, the cattle in the creek pasture moving toward the water in the early evening calm. The fence lines ran straight and true to the horizon. The barn was full. The house was warm. Everything that mattered was exactly where it was supposed to be. The deed stayed on the wall where Inez had put it, and it would stay there for as long as the ranch stood, which was a very long time. In the decades that followed, it would be seen by children and grandchildren who would ask about the names on it and the date. And the story would be told of the man who rode up to a widow's gate in the spring of 1879 and was offered the chance to take what was not his and instead said keep it, and meant it, and stayed. That was how it began, and that was how it grew, out of the particular integrity of a man who did not take what was not his, and the particular strength of a woman who did not give up what was hers, and the entirely unforeseen and entirely inevitable thing that happened when those two qualities met each other on a cattle ranch in Kansas in the middle of a hard spring, and found they were exactly what the other had been looking for. They did not use words like destiny, because they were practical people who knew that life is built from decisions and work, and the willingness to sit beside someone else's fire and be honest about what you are feeling. But sometimes, in the warmth of their house with the land running to the horizon around them, and their children moving through the rooms with all the natural ease of people who have never known a home that was uncertain, it was possible to look at the way things had arranged themselves and feel the quiet wonder of it. It was possible to look at the deed on the wall and the ranch outside the window, and the woman who had held on to both and the life that had grown up around her holding on, and to feel what could only be called grace, plain and actual, the way the best things in the hardest country always were.